I am playing Golden Sun currently, and the rate of random encounters while exploring the Kalima Forest had me thinking about the mechanic as a whole. So I got that dark thought in the back of my mind that I may need to spend a lot of time gathering data again. I wanted to see how random encounters have changed over time, and which are the most egregious examples. This would have been easier if there was a list somewhere with the actual games that contain random encounters. But it seems I couldn't find a good one, so I had to exhaustively look through hundreds upon hundreds of RPGs to compile my data. I then compiled at least 10 different random encounters and timed the interval between them, where the player was constantly moving. In some specific games, I also checked grass, cave, water, and running to get those figures. This gave me the encounter rate, which is a figure that shows the lower the number, the fewer seconds between encounters. I.e., if you were playing Suikoden, this would be 6.8. So, on average, after a battle, there is 6.8 seconds of movement before another battle. But before we dive in, it's worthwhile actually looking at the mechanic as a whole, tracing its origins back to old tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. The Dungeon Master would need to create battles for the party to come across, which meant literally rolling dice to determine when the group could fight some monsters at complete random. This was then adopted by early RPGs on the PC and Commodore 64, such as Wizardry, and then they were especially popularised in JRPGs such as Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. I'm specifically looking at battles which occur completely randomly, with no visual indication on screen. There are multiple types of RPGs that use blob encounters, such as Earthbound or Chrono Trigger, where you can see or know where the enemy encounters will be, and a lot of these can be avoided. These are not the RPGs that I am analysing here. The general consensus is that random encounters are not a fun mechanic. The reasons for this come from 1. The encounters often become repeated and uninteresting, and so you end up mashing the A button or fleeing from the encounter. And 2, the constant random battles break up travel, which means exploring a world can become extremely annoying no matter how interesting it is. Worse still, if you need to grind each of these encounters to get the required levels to explore, it's only going to sour the experience. Generally, most series as time goes on have dropped random encounters in favour of blob encounters, dynamic combat, or the ability to completely disable them in some cases. I do tend to agree with this. If I think of all the RPGs in my top 20 games, I would have Earthbound, Mother 3, Undertale, Paper Mario 1000 Year Door, Final Fantasy 6 and Baldur's Gate 3, and only Final Fantasy 6 and Undertale have random encounters here. I much prefer to have the option to avoid the combat if possible, and would rather have the encounters specifically crafted for the game. Well, how do random encounters actually work in some of these games? Unfortunately, it's difficult to actually compile a list of all of the mechanics specifically, but generally speaking, in the games that I checked, there is a number that is randomly generated within a range, and then every step the player takes will reduce the counter until it reaches 0, upon which, pop, a random battle will occur. We can take Final Fantasy 1 and Dragon Quest 1 as examples here, as we actually have information on their random encounter systems. A random number between 50 and 255 is generated, where each step counts down by the environmental factor. We also have the environmental factors as 6 on the overworld, 5 in a dungeon, and 2 while sailing. Though it is unfortunate that a step is not actually defined. It could be every pixel moved or every frame while moving. So let's do some maths. If you take the midpoint of 50 and 255, it would be 152.5. Then if we had infinite encounters on the overworld, we would know that the average would come to 152.5 divided by 6, or 25.42. The average time I calculated on the overworld with 10 different encounters is 4.8 seconds. So that means that per second there are about 5.3 steps. Similar maths is 5.1 steps per second in dungeons. Since the steps per second are 5.3 for overworld and 5.1 for dungeon, they are very close, which at least implies that the code and data that I've collected lines up a bit. Dragon Quest 1 is a bit crazier. It is straight up independent of steps, and each specific tile has an encounter rate based on their terrain. So, if it's a meadows tile, there is a 1 in 24 chance that if you step on it, you'll have an encounter. Let's assume you walk through 10 swamp tiles and get an encounter. This means the first tile is a 1 in 16 chance of an encounter, and 15 in 16 chance of no encounter. So 9 tiles in a row, we would have 15 over 16 to the power of 9. So in layman's terms, you have about 56% chance of walking through 9 tiles in the swamps with no encounters. If you take this to something like 100 steps, we would then get down to a 0.2% chance. Now, testing this practically, I purely stayed in forest tiles, which is a 1 in 16 chance, and I recorded specifically right after the end of another encounter. I noticed that you move 5 forest tiles in 1 second. So extrapolating this in terms of seconds instead of tiles, we see that for 1 second, it is about 77% chance of no encounter, 2 seconds is 56% chance of no encounter, and 3 seconds is a 41% chance of no encounter. But right there, between 2 and 3 seconds, is where we veer into the territory where it's more likely to encounter a battle than not. And I'll tell you what, if you take an average of those 10 Dragon Quest encounters, we actually get 2.45 seconds per encounter, which is shockingly close to that probability, which is great. It means my data lines up. I found 130 games that contain pure random encounters, and I'll list them now. You can't see your favourites here like Chrono Trigger or Saga. It's because it either contains scripted or blob encounters. I know there's probably a bunch of indie games on Steam that I've forgotten, or some Japan-only RPG that I've missed here, but I did try to get a fairly comprehensive list. The broad overview is that fewer and fewer games in modern times use random encounters, even when the amount of games being produced has never been higher. Along with this, the frequency of encounters was decreasing, favouring less intrusive battles. Looking at this in generational terms, if you go from the 3rd generation towards the 4th, there is a small dip, before it pushes up heading towards the 5th and 6th generations, where then, if you get to more modern consoles in the 7th to 9th generation, it dips slightly. But there is a series that seem to affect things the most in the data. Wizardry, which is one of the earliest series which inspired Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, involves moving throughout a dungeon in first-person perspective with a system akin to that of Dungeons & Dragons. In the dungeon there are random events, items and encounters. It just had a much higher encounter rate figure. I checked the original PC versions and the PS1 remakes to be sure. And if you look at the actual variants of these encounters, take Final Fantasy 1 on NES for example. I saw 20 separate encounters on the overworld dungeon and sailing, and the variation goes from 1 to 8 seconds per encounter, where in Wizardry, it varies from 1 to 25 seconds, which pushes its average up massively. If you remove Wizardry from the overall series, you'll see that the curve is much closer to what I would expect. Early generation RPGs with lots of very quick random encounters, before getting fewer and fewer as the games having random encounters dwindle, since the series then probably chose to adopt different mechanics or blob encounters. Checking the figures for the games with the most random encounters in the shortest space comes with the below games. Lufia and the Fortress of Doom with 3.1 seconds per encounter, Breath of Fire 3 with 3 seconds per encounter, Parasite Eve 1 with 2.6 seconds per encounter, Momotaro Densetsu 2 with 2.6 seconds per encounter, and at the top is Dragon Quest 1 with 2.5 seconds per encounter. Of these top games, Parasite Eve probably should be looked at slightly differently, owing the random encounters to the horror aspect of the game and the fact that they seem to be staged to happen early into a new room. I wouldn't exactly call these random encounters properly, but they do happen randomly. There are long stretches after these random encounters where you'll just be walking around room to room without anything happening. In Parasite Eve 2, they drop the random encounters entirely and just show you the enemies on screen where they will happen. In all of these other games, it's extremely tough to traverse the overworld. There are games like Vey on the Sega CD, which feel even quicker when you sprint around, as it recorded about 1 to 2 seconds per encounter, but When you're walking, the actual encounter rate is about 6.2 seconds per encounter. But Dragon Quest I is frankly a slog. It's one of the earliest RPGs, and the amount of times you take one step after an encounter and hit another encounter is tiresome. I did check the other two NES Dragon Quests by combing through forums and the source code. Dragon Quest II follows Dragon Quest I exactly, but I might have gotten unlucky with my 10 encounters, which have an average of 3.36 seconds per encounter, just out of the range of the top 5. Yet, looking at Dragon Quest 3 and 4, instead of 1 in 16 being the dungeon encounter rate, 95.75% chance of stepping on a tile with no encounter, Dragon Quest 3 and 4 bumps it up to 5 over 128, or 96.1% chance of stepping on a tile without an encounter. Grass is similarly up from 97% chance to 98.5%. These are enough of a change to push the average up to between 4 and 6 seconds in these areas, which, while it generally isn't much in the grand scheme of things, does make their encounter rate just that much more manageable. Conversely, when you look at the games with the longest times between fights, you'll get the following. Wild Arms 1 with 24.3 seconds per encounter, Wild Arms 2 with 24.4 seconds per encounter, and Wild Arms 3 with 24.4 seconds per encounter. Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey with 30.8 seconds per encounter. Lost Odyssey came top with 42.2 seconds per encounter. The first Wild Arms game has a generally low encounter rate, same as Wild Arms 5. But there are some interesting cases with the series changing how they handle random encounters. Wild Arms 2 and 3 have an ECN gauge, where you can press a button to avoid a random encounter if you press it quick enough. If you're successful, the gauge will tick down depending on the strength of the monster, where if it reaches 0, the next random encounter is mandatory. Technically, the encounter rate is about 7 to 9 seconds between battles, but since they are optional, it becomes murky. So I stuck to the encounter rate I saw in the videos to be sure. This does mean the series can fluctuate massively, and probably has the lowest random encounter rate of all of the series, if you took it to its extreme. Wild Arms 4 is a weird case, changing it up again, where random encounters happen, and then after beating a certain monster or solving a certain puzzle, there is a breakpoint, which gives you the option to turn on and off random encounters for that area. Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey is the last of the series with random encounters. There's nearly 3 times the series average, just allowing for more traversal to explore the world, it seems, before doing away with random encounters entirely. Lost Odyssey, I have nothing though. It's just a well-received RPG, it's cinematic, story-focused, and a lot of its areas have decent puzzles in them. So I suppose they just dialed down the encounter rate to allow for the actual puzzle and exploration elements to not be as frequently interrupted. I did see a complaint online about the game at how few battles there were in the game, so it isn't exactly unfounded. An aside, it might actually be useful to look at the encounter reducing spells, items and armors in these games. Back in 1986, though Dragon Quest I had a mental encounter rate, it probably was the first game to actually have something to reduce the encounter rate. I couldn't find anything in the Wizardry games that did, so I hope I'm correct. At level 15 you learn the Holy Protection spell, which means that for exactly 128 steps, any enemy at a lower level than you will not be encountered. You can also purchase Holy Water as an item that does the exact same thing. Final Fantasy, conversely, never introduced anything to reduce random encounters until Final Fantasy VI with the Moogle charms, though the 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV did introduce a safe travel augment. Pokemon has repels which you can buy, and they follow the Dragon Quest mechanic, though the different repels increase the step total that you can make. Also, some Pokemon have abilities like Stench, which will affect the encounter rate if they are the first Pokemon in your party. The Megami Tensei series introduces the Estoma spell in Shin Megami Tensei. The Tales series has Holy Bottles, Suikoden has the Champion Room, Breath of Fire has the MRBL3 item, Etrian Odyssey has the Ward Chime, Golden Sun has the Sacred Feather, Mega Man has Sneak Run, etc, etc. The ease of access to these repellent methods do contribute to the annoyance with random encounters. Since you can buy repels from the start in Pokemon, it doesn't feel so annoying to travel. But you have to wait until a certain level in Dragon Quest 1, or not at all in Final Fantasy 1, which will annoy the player. And speaking of annoyances, as I checked Reddit before making this video, on the most annoying random encounters in games, which gave the following list: Final Fantasy 1, Dragon Quest 1 and 2, Mother 1, Xenogears, Skies of Arcadia, Shin Megami Tensei, Tales of Phantasia, Tales of Destiny, Mega Man Star Force 2, Breath of Fire 1, 2 and 3, Digimon Story Dawn and Dusk, Suikoden 4, Lufia and the Fortress of Doom, Black Sigil, Wild Arms 1, Arabian Nights Desert Spirit King, and Arcana for the SNES. So I took the average encounter rate for each of these games and compared them to the generation average that they originate from. And if you look at these figures here, most of these games listed actually do have far more frequent random encounters than the generational average. But Xenogears and Wild Arms do stick out, just not as many as similar games. With Skies of Arcadia, this was heavily criticised, I saw in some forums, even though the random encounter rate is actually very close to the average in this generation. I personally believe it stems from the fact that Skies of Arcadia is viewed more as an exploratory game with its airship, and so having random encounters interrupt the interesting vistas will just sour people to it. It will just feel more annoying. Looking at the actual figures though, Black Sigil is down heavily from the generational average, but there are two games that I actually do want to speak about, and that's Suikoden 4 and Mega Man Star Force 4. With Suikoden, the encounter rate is essentially the same across all 5 games. Suikoden 4 was noted as a game with too many random encounters on the forum, and perhaps it's just from not changing the encounter rate as a franchise. With Mega Man Battle Network, this is an interesting case, where the encounter rate is quite different in Battle Network 1, but as the games go on up to Star Force 1, it's clear that they have stabilised around the 12-second mark. Then, for some unknown reason, Star Force 2 brings this rate down to Battle Network 1 levels. No discernible reason in the gameplay at all, as it follows the same basic system. Suikoden changes its mechanics over time as it moves between different systems, but the Battle Network and Star Force series basically follow the same principle, being only on the GBA and the DS. But Star Force 2 just bucks the trend for one game. I have no idea why. Before wrapping up, it's probably good to look at the other two big series and their evolution, as they have some interesting quirks. Final Fantasy is one of the game series you probably think about when RPGs are brought up. As expected, the NES and SNES games have pretty low encounter rates, but this rate increases as time goes on, before removing random encounters entirely in Final Fantasy XII for the single player games. Final Fantasy VIII, however, has a noticeable dip, and while there are certainly annoying parts in the game, like the Deep Sea Research Center, it seems that this comes more from the grindy nature of the game mechanics. With the need for summon monsters and drawing spells from enemies to work, I believe it was decided that the player needed to encounter more monsters to support the battle system. That meant the encounter rate must have been dropped on purpose. Once we go back to Final Fantasy IX's more traditional battle system, the encounter rate is nearly identical to Final Fantasy VII's. Finally, you can't talk about evolution without talking about Pokemon. The purpose for these random encounters in Pokemon is not to gather XP, but instead to collect a team of monsters. The actual level progression comes from the stationary and carefully crafted trainer battles, since you earn more XP from trainer Pokemon than wild Pokemon. The actual purpose of the random encounters is to help gather your team. You can see this quite well in the design of the routes in the early Pokemon games. But this is just for the grass patches. We should probably speak about the sea routes and the caves as well. These areas in the games have random encounters, and these areas are pretty mandatory for you to travel through in order to progress the game. But since it's mandatory to actually explore these areas, the encounter rate is actually far higher, meaning it isn't such a slog to go through these areas. And it's quite clear here how the encounter rate does slowly creep up as the games go on, but the grass stays quite consistent, purely as this seems to be optional and the purpose is to actively seek Pokemon. And this is quite interesting as the games go on, the encounter rate in more mandatory areas increases quite a lot, so you find less and less frequent random encounters. But there are exclusive Pokemon to these areas, so people who want to collect them are going to be annoyed by having to run around for longer, and people who don't want to collect them still have to deal with random encounters, which is why in the more recent games they've just done away with random encounters in these areas entirely. For now, I'm personally happy that random encounters have trailed off in RPGs, since they were the most unsatisfying parts of the games for me. But they can be an effective mechanic if you tailor them around the game's mechanics and themes. Let's take a case study of Fantasian, a game that released in 2021 made by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the original Final Fantasy creator. In this game, you fill up a meter with random encounters, with an upper limit of around 50 monsters. And then, when you gather over this limit, you're forced to fight all of them. The battle mechanics are designed around the phone touchscreen and attacking multiple enemies in arcs and areas. So, when you have upwards of 10 to 20 enemies on screen at once, it is quite cathartic to attack big chunks of these enemies in one go. It adds a lot of risk and reward to the battles, meaning that you'll get more difficult fights with more enemies, but you spend far less time grinding random encounters and gaining more XP from this one more exciting fight. It's a well thought out game where every aspect of the game mechanics are intrinsic to the theme and how it plays. Random encounters aren't a mechanic that simply cannot work. In olden times, random encounters were simply the staple of the series because 1, that's what other games in the genre had done, and 2, they had massive system limitations. Whereas now, does the mechanic enhance the gameplay or the story? If it doesn't, then does it need to be in the game?